So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on what for some of us is a lovely summer evening to talk about tech. We're
Yay.
so excited for this talk because we do think it's, all joking aside, a very, very important topic in our
Yes.
lives and our children's lives. But
As you
before,
guys are coming in, if you want to send us, oh, we have the Q&A feature for questions. And then if I don't think we have a regular, let me see the regular chat. It looks like you should be able to also access the chat if you want to put in how old your kids are or any other questions. Erin and I will take turns trying to read as we speak, which is not a strong suit for either of us to read and talk at the same time, but we're going to take turns. And we'll just give it maybe a couple minutes for people to get in. Let me pull up our slides. Erin, is that looking good to you on your end? Can you see well?
looking good on my end.
Perfect.
I have to laugh as everyone's coming in. Just a little personal side note that I'm at my in-laws right now. They're doing a great job of helping me with my toddler, but yet the dog may interrupt our webinar.
That's okay. We welcome dogs and children to interrupt. I thought you were going to say the funny story was going to be that you put your child in front of a screen so you could do a talk on tech. I thought that was
Oh,
going to be the way it
definitely do. Just
would.
going on.
It's just about the dog.
Just
Just
about
the dog. Okay, let's see what time it is. Maybe we will get going because we have so much content in this talk because this subject is bursting at the seams and there's so many things that we could say. And again, because we don't know everybody who's here, let us know ages or specific questions, use the Q&A or the chat, and we are happy to tailor this to your circumstances as much as possible and make sure you get some super practical information tonight with some real strategies about tech, which is such a confusing and stressful area for so many of us at so many ages. Just to start with introductions, I'll go first. I'm Marielle Benjamin. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I have been working for the last 17-ish years in early childhood development, both as a clinician and working in the Mount Sinai Parenting Center, training healthcare providers on evidence-based parenting practices, and working with parents in this type of way, small group settings, just like we do at Cooper for the last 9 years. I have Maddie, who is making the kissy face in the front, who is 11, and Lucas, who just turned 9. And I am the director of groups at Cooper. And I get to work every day with the wonderful and incomparable Erin O'Connor.
Well, thank you. It's always a pleasure with you. So my name is Erin O'Connor. I am the Chief of Education here at Cooper. I am also a professor at New York University where I direct the early childhood program, and I've been there since 2005. I also run a lab that looks at the impacts of children's early caregiving relationships on their development, both in early childhood as well as all the way through adolescence and beyond. And probably most importantly, I am the daughter to Haley, the little one there, who is a toddler, and Ashley, who is a teenager. So I've got the developmental spectrum in my house.
And Muffin's the dog, who may make an appearance. So
And Muffin, the dog, exactly.
never know.
And Kevin, the husband.
And Kevin, that's right. Totally on the side. So likely if you're joining us tonight, you are a Cooper member, and we don't have to convince you about how incredible Cooper is, but just in case you got here and you don't know how you got here, Cooper is a virtual parenting platform. We are creating the village that all of us need so desperately in our parenting lives. Our core feature is monthly parenting groups led by facilitators like Erin and I and a great team, following basically the developmental trajectory of your child, age and stage, and the highs, the lows, everything in between. Really practical, grounded advice that comes from evidence and what we know from science on how children grow and learn and thrive and develop. We also do office hours every week, so you never have to hold on to a question, talks like this, and lots of other features as part of being a Cooper member. So If for some reason you're here and you're not, then we would love to tell you more about it. Reach out to us anytime. And hopefully you are part of our Cooper family and you are loving it. So without further ado, we're going to get into today. We're going to start with understanding development and the implications for technology use. Then we're going to talk about skill building to support all of that technology use and strategies that you can use this summer with plenty of time for questions.
And I think we should start with a question that we have. And that is I have a 2-year-old that is already showing signs of tech dependency. How do I wean them off? So I think this relates also to sort of what we're talking about right now, which is not all screens are created equal, right? So definitely when we think about tech dependency, it can be a concern, right? You don't want your child in front of the screen too much. And at 2 years of age, transitions are really hard, right? So it might not necessarily be that you're taking the screen away from them, and that's why they get upset. It's also that transition from I was really into this show, and now all of a sudden, like, it's just taken away from me, and now I'm really sad about that. The same thing can happen at the playground. The same thing can happen in multiple places, right? So I think something to think about is whether it's a tech dependency or if it's difficulty with transitions, totally developmentally appropriate. Just, a few quick tips around that. It's giving, sort of a few warnings, like not just turning the TV off, but saying, okay, we're going to go to the first, we're going to put on our shoes, we're going to go to the playground. So, I'm going to count to 15 and then we'll turn the show off, but probably watch it later. So just giving a few sort of, quote unquote warning. I don't want to call them warnings because they're not warnings, but sort of heads ups as to what's happening might help around that issue with a 2-year-old.
The other thing I would just add is that 2-year-olds are particularly interested in anything you're interested in. And one thing parents very often don't think about, and we're going to circle back at the end, is your own tech use. And your child at 2 knows that that phone is really important to you, right? Or that remote control that you just won't let them take apart and bang on the table, right? And even that understanding can make it really appealing and can look like, oh my gosh, my kid is already so obsessed with the phone. And not that they couldn't be obsessed with the phone, but they also just understand the value of that in the home. And so there is some logic to also just thinking about what everybody else is doing and modeling around tech use in front of our young people, because that can have that same sort of hunting quality where kids are just always trying to get their hands on the phone. Sorry for the interruption, Erin.
No, that was great. So, and again, when we are thinking about concerns over screen time, not all screen time is, sort of created equal. There can be great opportunities for co-viewing a show, an educational or age-appropriate show with your child. There's a ton of evidence on Daniel Tiger, as well as I'm sure other shows that are up and coming, showing that by viewing that show with your child and talking about some of the lessons that the show is talking about can be a really great experience. It's both shows your child you're interested in the same thing that they are, as well as talking about whatever the lesson is at hand, like sharing. FaceTime is a great way to stay connected, right, with families, friends who are not, necessarily close to you physically. You have to use a lot of the same sort of social skills, cues, etiquette with FaceTime that you do if you're actually with a person. So that's a great way to learn different social skills. And then there are a lot of apps and various things that allow for creativity, like Girls That Code. So, it's not to say that all screen time is bad. So what we want to do is really first give a little bit of like, okay, what is going on right now? And then why you want to think about the technology that's going on in your household. So right now, the great news is, and when I say right now, I really mean at any developmental stage, but especially as the mother of a teen and somebody who researches teens as well, especially before the teen years, the main difference is you, right? Parent-child relationships in all the research really shows that's the biggest predictor sort of children's behaviors, and whether they engage in risky behaviors or do not. A lot of it is grounded in how comfortable they feel with a parent or a caregiver, and how comfortable they feel coming to them. It's less about screens in your relationship, right? So while it's very important to think about screens and the role that they're playing, really thinking about your relationship is where you want to be at. External limits tend not to promote internal skills. So saying, no screen time, but not explaining why no screen time doesn't tend to be effective. You want to, or, no texting. Well, we're not going to text because sometimes it hurts people's feelings. And I know you're really committed to your relationship with Maddie, and it might upset Maddie's, it might upset Maddie if she doesn't understand sort of the undertone of the text. So we're not going to do texting right now. And modeling, just like Marielle was saying, really matters. So if you're, and I'm guilty of this, as I'm sure many of you are as well, on your phone a lot, your child's going to think, okay, that's acceptable. That's sort of what we do. We're on our phone. So it's really about you right now, which can feel daunting, but is a good thing.
If you're panicking right now, we mean it as a good thing. Like there's still a lot of opportunity to leverage that relationship to get healthy skills versus when, not that that relationship is less important, but obviously as we age, that relationship tends to not be the only sort of important influence in our lives. So no pressure for anyone out there who's panicking and ready to drop off the call. But if you did want to pour yourself a glass of wine, we would also support that too.
So when we think today, we're focusing a lot on sort of thinking about that 9 to 10-year-old range, because this is where we often come into that. Some friends have cell phones, some friends have more access to the internet. So when we're talking about sort of where your child is now, we're thinking a lot about sort of that third to fourth grade age. But again, a lot of this applies across the developmental spectrum. So especially from third grade and beyond. So with social development, right, this is when children are really getting to have this emerging sense of identity. Who am I? Where do I stand in the world? A lot of it's influenced by how they think others perceive them. It's also a time when they're beginning to understand more nuances of social situations, right? So they are starting to realize, like, somebody can be really nice to me in person or in real time, but then they might kind of stab me in the back. And that can be kind of jarring, right? Because up until that point, you're kind of believing what is going on in face value. There's also somewhat of a shift in friendships where it goes from quantity to quality to an extent. So children tend to be forming smaller groups of friendships, but those friendships matter a lot, and there are a lot of more emotional investment in them than before. So, just in thinking about, which we're going to talk about in a sec, but in tech and the different things that can happen with tech, it can have a larger impact at this stage than maybe it does at others. The children are also learning perspective taking skills. So, right, this is a great thing. They can understand that, you may have a completely different perspective than I do. And learning how to navigate that others have different perspectives and also to accept other perspectives is something that's also going on at this stage in the game. So when we think about what, sort of is going on socially at this stage, it's really all about relationships, right? It's really about relationships with their parents, these burgeoning relationships that are becoming very important with their friends. So what could be the implications of tech on those? Well, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, there's no tone in text messaging, right? So it can be a place where a lot of arguments and misunderstandings happen, and where there's not healthy conflict resolution. It's also a place where you can engage in cyberbullying, and the whole phenomenon, right, of ghosting, which that just I guess happened when I was a kid too, but it didn't have a term, and it's definitely easier if your relationships are more virtual than in person, because you can just not return the text, you can not return the Snapchat. So the implication for relationships a lot of the time is that there's not that healthy intimacy in them that there should be at this age. So then when we think of other areas of development at this stage, such as emotional development, children, and again, like this, tends to be around the 9 to 10-year-old age range, but goes below and beyond that as well, is really working on emotion regulation skills, right? Thinking about pausing before reacting. And this is, of course, so important when we think about virtual interactions, because they're often permanent and also you don't have sort of that ability to discuss things through with somebody. There's also, which is sort of an exciting part of this stage in development, children are understanding sort of the subtleties of emotion, right? So it's not like I'm mad, I'm sad. It can be like, I'm not really sad, but I'm disappointed because I really wanted to, make the basketball team. I didn't. I put a lot of work into it. And so there's a little bit more nuance to the emotion, as well as more intense mood swings, thanks to puberty. And this generation, I think, to an extent, or at least research would suggest more than other generations, are really aware of the actual dangers, such as climate change and natural disasters, and things that really could impact their sort of experience as adults. And that is playing a role in anxiety levels. And so when we think about sort of tech and we think about the information that children are consuming, you want awareness, but there's also a lot of alarmist stuff out there. So sometimes that can increase anxiety. So again, really thinking about mental health at this age and the implications of tech use based on where we know children are emotionally. This is a time where their prefrontal cortex is really developing. That's the sort of the control center of the brain, right? And because it's still developing, they're also very vulnerable to sort of dopamine rushes, right? These neurochemicals in the brain that make them feel really good or can make you feel kind of lousy. And that's, sort of very volatile at this stage in the game. Girls are most vulnerable between the ages of 11 and 13 to social media when it comes to things like body image and self-esteem. And what's I thought was interesting, and this is among teens, so probably older than a lot of our participants' children are right now, but an experiment found that reducing social media use to under an hour a day improved self-esteem and body image. And I think that's really interesting when we think about, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the fact that the Surgeon General recently put out sort of a warning about social media use and gave a lot of concern to parents, especially if it was more than 3 hours. And a lot of teens were on it, especially girls, for more than 3 hours a day. And there were a lot of negative implications for that. So mental health definitely something we want to think about when we decide how we want to manage cell phones and whatnot. So cognitively, a lot of this is, sort of interacts with emotional development and the other ones we've been talking about, but there can be sort of some challenges in balancing priorities, attention, and focus, right? So, like I was saying before, but with the prefrontal cortex sort of still forming and the areas of the brain that really are responsible for executive function still developing, sometimes it can be hard to figure out, okay, what is most important to prioritize? What can I let go? And sometimes if you add a lot of peer pressure that's virtual onto that, it can be hard. It's also a time when, while we're really focused on our parents, we're also trying to figure out who we are apart from our parents. So, really exploring independent thought and decision making from our parents is an important part of this stage in development. So, where does tech fall into all this? So, it's hard to process sometimes what you're exposed to online when you're at this stage in development, right? You're just sort of figuring out your identity, you're figuring out impulse control. It can be really hard to process if you see something disturbing, what is going on there, why it's disturbing to you, how to like move on from it. It's a time that we want to try to protect our kids from seeing things like porn on online. There's a lack of judgment or impulse control, right? So we've all heard these stories of, someone posts something, someone texts something, it's there forever. It was an in the moment knee jerk reaction, but it can have long term implications. And I think something that's really important that we don't talk about a lot is it supplants hands on learning. So there's a huge body of learning sciences showing the importance of actually learning hands on. So actually going out there and like building something or, I'm not saying like building a boat, but, engaging in some sort of hands on learning experience that's not tech related. Those experiences tend to be related to children's cognitive development much more positively than things that are virtual. Even not to say that all virtual is bad, but hands on, definitely a good thing. Attention, again, this sort of relates somewhat to emotion, somewhat to cognition. children who have difficulty with attention, interestingly, are often more absorbed by screens than children who don't. So there's a burgeoning sort of research field that children who exhibit signs of ADHD tend to be more sort of absorbed by screens than those who do not. Um, Also, for children who have somewhat more difficulty with attention and emotion, parents tend to use screen time more just as a way, which is totally understandable, to sort of get through different activities, but it's just something for us to be aware of. So we have to think about sort of if our kids need extra support in developing some of these skills, maybe we should be particularly aware of the amount of screen time that they are exposed to. And then physical development. So, as all of you who have had a child in this age group, right, you know that this is like, I looked at Ashley, I think one day, and like she felt like a little girl to me. And then I was like, oh my God, who is this child that I'm waking up in the morning, right? Like there's such a huge growth spurt. And because of that, it's like you want them in team sports, you want them to have physical activity, at least 1 hour of physical activity a day. 10 to 14 hours of sleep are recommended. So this is a time of amazing physical development, just like, you know, sort of 0 to 1 is a time of amazing physical development. So is middle childhood. So what are the implications of tech for that? Well, children are more sensitive to light than adults. So we know that the blue light from screens is not good for any of us. But for children, they're even more sensitive. So it's even harder for them to fall asleep if they've had a screen in front of their face. And they're also the melatonin is suppressed as much as adults by exposure to light in the evening. So again, not a great thing. And, you know, they supplant other activities. So if you're on a screen, you're probably not actively engaging in a team sport. So again, it's, I think a lot of the times when we think of screens, it's what it supplants, not necessarily the screen itself. That's the issue. But every child is different. And Marielle is going to talk a little bit about sort of some of the things that we can do in order to support our children based on where they are. And also just thinking about temperament and environment plays a huge role in how screens impact children. And age is not necessarily the predictor of skill or ability, it's the individual child. So how do we support children this summer when we're thinking about screens?
How do we? I don't know. So I think again, as Erin was saying, it's less about the age of your child if we have a wide range of ages in the audience, and more about the sort of skills that we know that kids need. We get the question all the time in Coop groups and in every talk that we give, what is the right age? Like, what's the magic age for social media? What's the right age for how much TV? The AAP obviously has recommendations that are very general about that. But what it's really helpful to sort of think about is not how much or what age, but what skills would I need to see to feel like my child can do that. So for little kids, it might be like, I take you off the screen and you have a crazy temper tantrum. Or my personal favorite is when you're having a tantrum. So I start the screen to get you to stop. And then as soon as the screen's over, the temper tantrum is still there, right? Because we never did any of the sort of like recovery. We just like paused it for a second, like the show. That would be a sign that maybe that screen time just isn't developmentally appropriate for who your child is and where your child is. For the older teens, it might be something like Erin was just saying, they're not participating in sports or school or friendships in the same way they used to. And so they can't handle that, or they're not terribly responsible. And so an $1,100 device in their pocket is probably not a good idea when they lose it 3 times a week, right? So it's more about the skills than it is about this magic bullet. So we're going to go through sort of some of those in general, and we've touched on some of them before. So I'll try not to repeat myself too much. But the skills of self-regulation. So it's important to remember we are all regulating across 3 areas at any given time: our attention, our behavior, and our emotions. In this case, it's really fitting into that cognitive bucket that Erin described, which is that wizard versus lizard brain. That's impulse control. How much can I feel something and then pause to make a thoughtful decision? They've done studies that if we all on Facebook groups and all the other kind of sort of hysterical, polarizing social media that we do, if we counted to 5 before we responded, we reduce the likelihood that we would send an inflammatory message by over 50%, right? By counting to 5. So impulse control is something we're all working on. If you have road rage, you're working on it too as a grown-up, right? And thinking about how can we handle things calmly? How can we feel disappointed, feel angry, feel frustrated, and learn to regulate that before we would have access to a screen or access to something like social media in doing that. So thinking about working in these skills with your children, how can you work on that pause between feeling something and then thinking about what to do? How can you work on working through and moving through difficult emotions? And how can you find the calm down strategies that help your particular child to regulate themselves, to go from 60 back to 0, right? What does that look like for you? And that's going to be a different toolbox. But those would be the skills in that area that would help you know maybe my child's ready or would be more prepared to handle tech. In the impulse control, so think before you act, as we just mentioned, practice delayed gratification, right? So toddlers don't have delayed gratification. It's not a thing that they're particularly good at. I'm sure all of you have experienced this for yourself. There are just times where waiting is really hard to do. But if we're going to ask our children, when it comes to tech, to wait, to think thoughtfully, to take some time in between that feeling and that action, then we've got to practice that delayed gratification and all kinds of ways that we can give you to do that. Understanding consequences. Are your children going to understand that sending a picture today means 10 years from now it might be there? Do you understand that posting a picture of your child today means that in 10 years when your child can comment on that picture, it would still be there, right? Can we live with the consequences of responsible media and tech use? And if our kids can't, then that might be something we need to work on before we would feel comfortable with them out there. In terms of attention, as Erin touched on, we know our kids need to learn how to be bored. We know that they need to work through the creativity and the problem solving that comes from being stuck in something, right? And we have to help them get those skills. If they're never bored, because they can always pull out their phone. One of my favorite pieces in The Onion was once a picture at a train stop of every single person looking at their phone while the train is coming, and one person looking down the track to see if the train was coming. And they circled the person and said, "Person caught, actually waiting." Right? So few of us are used to using that muscle anymore. So for our children, we can't ask that of them if they're not practicing it. Are they following their interests and their curiosity? Are they giving their attention to things they really care about? Are they having trouble managing and regulating that attention? Do they take frequent breaks? Are they watching a show, pausing it, giving you 10 jumping jacks, run around after the dog 10 times and come back? Is that something that they're able to do to help their attention and to help sort of create those little moments of regulation for them if they can't do it for themselves? In terms of their identity and their self-esteem, avoiding labels. We know that children who think they are a certain way, that it can be harmful to their development, whether that label is a positive label or a negative label. We want to try to think of creating a sense of belonging for our children, that they feel a part of something, a part of our family, a part of our community, a part of our culture. All of those are important indications around self-esteem. And we want to know that our child has a somewhat healthy sense of self before they are consuming large quantities of social media or tech exposure, because they are so vulnerable to different ideas and to outside influences. And so as much as we can make sure we build that up in the moments we have our children, we can sort of mitigate the impact of all of those influences. And that goes to that strong parent-child relationship. As Erin started the talk, we start all of our talks with a reminder of how important this relationship is. Again, not as pressure, but because while you are having your child view the world through that expected safety and response of a loving parent, you have the opportunity to use that to say, look, I know that you feel really left out because everybody else is doing this and you're not going to do this. And I'm here for you with those feelings. So I'm not going to fix it, but I'm going to leverage that we love each other and we have that connection to help you through something that's hard. And if you feel like you're leaning into tech because you're not having that quality in the relationship with your children at a time when they're, caring more about their friends or leaving the house more, then that's a time to turn inward and say, let's build that before I'm just giving in to all of the other tech demands. With friendships, Do our children know how to resolve conflicts? As Erin mentioned, chat is not the right time to learn what to do when you've hurt somebody's feelings or you're not getting along. So it doesn't mean you can't be chatting and learn that, but we've got to make sure our kids know how to do that in person. If any of you like sent your kids to camp for the first time this week or last week, that feeling of like, I don't remember how to make friends. I don't remember how to talk to people. I don't know. I don't know what to do if nobody will eat lunch with me. Those are the moments they need to work through to gain those skills in human contact so that we're balancing whatever they're doing in their tech life. Do they know how to talk to adults about relationships? Do they know how to flag something beyond, and we'll talk about parental controls and you monitoring, but beyond that, do they know how to bring that kind of question to you? And do they understand the value of the friend who isn't really reliable and doesn't always answer your messages, but sends you really funny, emoji filled messages, talking to each other in emojis that make you laugh and feel good, but that isn't the person you tell your secrets to, right? Maybe that person doesn't understand the value of that friendship in the same way. And the last one is responsibility. So as we mentioned, are they accountable for their behaviors? Particularly around the sort of 7 to 10, that's a tough time where kids do not like to take accountability for what they did. They love to tell you, it was not my fault. It was an accident. I didn't do anything, right? That's the classic response. So how can they be accountable for their actions? How can we work towards making them reliable? They say what they mean and they do what they say, right? Qualities that are really important for us to trust them with devices and with less limits around tech, shall we say? And what does citizenship look like in your home? How does your child show up as a responsible participant in your house, again, in your community, in your larger family? What does that look like? And all of those skills, if we can build all of these outside of tech, then we can sort of walk into that tech discussion with a kid who's got more resources to draw on. We never want you to feel like, you can't back out of tech. You can always back out and disconnect from it and take the time to build the skills, but it's very hard to build those skills that we just went over through tech. So this is the kind of work that you have to do to supplement that. Okay, I'm going to breathe and we're going to go into specific strategies, reminding everybody that we have the Q&A if anybody has any questions about anything we've said. So these are sort of like this summer, you're in this talk, it's mid-June, it's end of June. Oh my God, it's end of June. Ridiculous. Somehow that already happened. And you're like, what do I do today? Well, let's make sure you have some consistent rules around devices. Really, no matter how old your child is, you need to have some rules. And this is not us telling you there's only one way to parent. It's that if there are no limits, you're really calling on your child to regulate this for themselves. And that we're pretty convinced they can't do. So there need to be some consistent limits. It doesn't have to be all of the ones that Erin might have, or, as few as your sister may have, but somewhere in there, you want it to be something that feels like there are sort of guide rails to help you, like the bumpers in the bowling alley lane, right? There are going to be general rules, like we don't use our devices after 6 p.m. because we know about the impact of sleep, or we don't use our devices at the dinner table. Some of those are in here. So we'll give you some ideas if you're not sure what those rules should look like. We want you to really think about focusing on actions and behaviors needed to maintain it. So instead of screen time, parents so often say, if you don't eat all of your vegetables, there's no TV show, which is totally a disconnected consequence. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't motivate a 3-year-old to eat their food for any of the right reasons. We can talk about meals in a different talk, but for all of that, we really want to focus on what are the behaviors. So I'm going to let you watch a show. If you can show me that you can handle it calmly when the show is over, then it lets me know that you can watch more shows, right? That's the behavior that reflects that your child can be responsible to have that, right? If we do this and then you can't go to sleep at night, we're going to know that had something to do with the screens, and we're going to change our rule about the screens so that we're really specific about what we're looking for with shows or access to social media or devices of any kind. You might want to think about a technology contract. So if any of you are in that age and stage of thinking about something like Wait Till 8 or any of the other programs that are out there around a contract, it can be a really sort of powerful community decision to say a group of us are going to join together. Our children are not going to have access to social media or smartphones for a certain amount of time. But even if you're on your own island doing this for yourself, think about a contract around behavior and expectations that your child agrees to. So yes, you are going to get a phone, but you agree here too, not downloading any apps without our permission, not engaging in any behavior online that wouldn't be okay in person, not sending any photographs of yourself to someone you don't know, right? It can be very detailed. There's great examples online. Common Sense Media has some great sort of templates that you can start with, but you want to have something that you and your child sit down together and agree to. This is going to be what it looks like. This is your end of the bargain. This is mine. And at any time we can say this isn't working for either of us and we might need to revisit it. Make it really clear, and then you actually have to do it, that you are going to be monitoring all device use. So for a very long time, and I don't know, Erin, if you have an opinion on when that stops, you're really up against your child's privacy, but in order to preserve their safety and the wellness of their relationships. So if your child is brand new to a fourth grade chat, you need to read those messages. There's just no other way for you to know if your child can handle the type of content that they're being exposed to. If you have a much older child who's been doing this for a while and has shown you good judgment and things haven't come up, then you can talk about the messages you don't need to read that can be private, because we definitely don't want to tell our children that they're not allowed to have private moments and private relationships and private conversations. But somewhere along this line, we need them to prove it to us is a little strong, but we need them to display their ability to sort of handle this. And I know this as a parent, both Erin and I know this personally, it is exhausting. Nobody wants to read these messages. This is not the fun part, but it's actually such an incredible way to learn what your kids are up against in terms of what the content of those and quality of those conversations are like.
I
Erin,
also, sorry to
yeah.
interrupt.
No,
think
please.
like your child's willingness to come to you when they feel uncomfortable about what's going on over text, like you're monitoring it when they're younger, but also just taking note of maybe I noticed something that felt a little off on this text chain, but I'm not going to mention it at first. I'm just going to see if my child brings it up to me and wants to talk it out with me. And if not, fine too, like then bring it up. But I think it's like a nice way to sort of gauge how comfortable your child is with bringing up these difficult topics and issues with you, because often what happens in fourth grade, right, might not have as many consequences as what happens in eighth and ninth grade. So you want to sort of set those expectations up early.
Absolutely. And we have such great research that you want to get to know your child's friends. And I think we can both attest to the fact that gets harder to do as they get older, because it's not like play dates where you're on all of them and parents that you've spent a ton of time with. But one great way to get to know your child's friends is to be part of their chat communication. So if you're looking for the silver lining on having to do that heavy lifting, it's that you really get to know strong personalities and what people are saying and what they love to talk about and what video games they can't get enough of. And all of that sort of provides really interesting and valuable information for getting to know your child's world in that way. Then you want to think about all devices being in a shared space. So lots of data about, bad things generally happening when kids have their phones in their rooms late at night when parents have gone to sleep and they think that screen time is over. And again, calling on kids to have more regulatory abilities than is necessarily age appropriate, right? It's really hard to end that message, to shut that off. God, we're so old that it was like you wanted a private phone line in your room so you could like talk on the phone till 3:00 in the morning. Now there's so many things going on. It's really hard for them to disconnect, and it can be impacting sleep in a way you didn't know, that you had no idea your child was on their device so late at night, and you've been thinking that they went to bed when you went to bed. So storing them in a shared space, having a charging station, having everybody in the family honor that, which I know, again, bumps up against us and what we want to model, but really holding to that practice as more than just like, I'm being irritating about it, but here's the real reasons why I know it's not a good idea for you. Thinking about taking headphones off. So this is especially true in the like YouTube world of small children who start with a YouTube video that is totally appropriate, and then because of the algorithm are fed some really inappropriate content next and wander, I don't know what other word you could use for it, but wander along the algorithm to something that if you are not listening, is very hard for you to monitor. So as much as possible, thinking about using a family room or a den or a kitchen as the place where your kids are accessing their technology, and having volume up, headphones off, so that you are walking by, you are cooking, you are doing your own work, you are just in that space, and you can keep half of one ear out for what is going on. And the number of times, I'm sure, Erin, you've had this too, where I've just been like, what? Who? What is that person saying? I'm sorry, what are you watching? You know, and maybe it's just a science video, and I'm like, you're doing what experiment? You know, the other day my kids were sending an egg up into space on some NASA thing that they were watching. And it took me a second to be like, an egg? What are they saying? You know, that feeling is really helpful and protective for your kids. So as much as you can think about making it more an everybody time while I'm watching tech, not this sort of private thing you do in your room alone.
I love that point. I think it's so important that it's not a private thing you do alone. That's where you sort of can get some not so great interactions happening, but that this is something we're all engaged in. And it also just shows that you're really interested in what your child's interested in.
Absolutely.
Great for self-esteem and parent-child relationships and
Yeah.
on
And
and
if
on.
they want privacy, it's very easy to explain that you tune out 90% of what is going on in your living room. As I always tell my daughter when she's like, but I don't want you to hear how silly this show is. I know you think this show is so silly. And I'm like, you wish I was listening to this, but I'm sitting right next to you and I'm totally checked. I'm taking a nap. So don't you worry about me judging the content of your show. Oh, I think we got a question. Can we send the deck to all who are registered? Oh, hi, Suzanne. Welcome. Sorry you were late. We're going to have the recording up. So the recording will definitely have the screen share. So that's the good news. And we also have a handout, which I think will come in the follow-up, which has these particular tips in the what to do right now. So you can have those takeaways too. So take frequent breaks. So again, physical activity and also just breaking attention. As Erin mentioned, that dopamine just flood of stimulation that your kids are getting needs small interruptions. So even saying every 20 minutes, we're going to set the timer and we're going to get up and just move our bodies. You know, like the whole idea that the commercial break was when you got up and went to the bathroom and got water and like checked in with yourself and how you were feeling doesn't exist for our kids in the world of streaming, right? And so they don't take many breaks. And so really consciously building them in actually has some good logic and science behind it, as opposed to just being like, oh, thank God I never watch commercials anymore. Although if you watch live sports with your kids, you end up watching a lot of commercials, which Erin knows is one of the bane of my existence, is figuring out how to explain commercials to my kids. But that's a different story for a different day. Have strong passwords. You're not trying to build your child's skills to play detective and figure out, code breaking around your password, but you do need to do your basic due diligence to have passwords on devices of your own that contain inappropriate content, right? We're not here to tell you you can't have inappropriate content on your devices. We're just here to tell you that it can and does happen every single day that children access something on your device that you wish they didn't see. And so having strong passwords of your own and thinking about things like handing your phone to your child when you may have content on your phone. Once your child can read, for example, and they can go into your texts and see things that you've said, it's a very different sort of microscope that you're putting your own tech usage under. So having strong passwords is just a really responsible thing to do about your own devices. Thinking about avoiding screen times during meals, we have a lot of evidence around increased risk of obesity for children who are distracted while they eat, who don't learn regulation around their appetite, who eat beyond when they may be full because they are just, I think of it as popcorn in the movies where like they keep making that tub bigger and I keep finishing it. And I don't think anything has changed in my appetite around popcorn. I think it's just that while watching a movie, I will do this repetitive motion until there's nothing left to grab. So even though we use it a lot in the toddler years, it's not the best, healthiest sort of technique. If you feel like you need different distraction to get your children to sit at meals longer, think about something that doesn't monopolize their attention in such a profound way as a screen or a device. And then before bed, as Erin mentioned, really important data that 1 to 3 hours before bedtime is the ideal for kids. There was even a study that compared screen time at night to a shot of espresso equivalent for children in terms of how stimulating it can be for younger children. So always just try to keep that in mind, even though it might be a wind down thing for you, or you have to put another child to bed, so you need the screen. It just may not be doing you any favors when it comes to actually getting your kids to sleep. And that might be a time to think about an audiobook or, something else that is a little less stimulating, but can provide some level of distraction. Educate your child so they can recognize someone that could be untrustworthy or dangerous. So the reality of using screens, especially on many of the games marketed towards kids really 6 and up, have a chat feature that can be accessed by strangers. So talking to your children about never responding to a message for a person they don't know. And remember, they have screen names, so it's going to be very hard for them to know. So if they say, do you go to my school? And then they give the school name, it's very easy for someone to pretend that they are somebody that they're not. So talking to your children about that, talking about everybody online not having the best intentions, right? That we don't know people more because they like the same game as we would know of them if we walked into them on the playground or the street, that there's not that familiarity just because it feels like we have more in common, or it feels like the world is, ironically, when you're on a screen, it feels smaller, even though it's so much bigger, but it feels more intimate in that way. So really explaining to them what those kinds of questions they should never answer about their name, about their address, about their school, about giving away personal information, about sending photographs of themselves, and being really explicit about it online. The match to this is that you must, I'm sorry to be the one to tell you, but you must talk to your children about pornography online if they are using any search functions. And you can simply, there are some great books about this, but you can simply say something like, there are a lot of things online that were meant for grownups and that children don't need to see, right? And that can include naked pictures. And if you ever see anything with naked people or that feels confusing, you close the screen and you tell it a grown-up, right? It doesn't have to be an explanation beyond that can be really age appropriate, but you do want to give your kids a warning that there is stuff out there that probably isn't good for them. And not in a scary way, but just in a sort of developmentally appropriate way. Erin, anything to add on the safety things?
No, I think that's
Okay.
perfect.
Remind them that they can always come and talk to you, that you're not going to be mad. We love to say, I won't be mad. We don't always mean it. In this case, you want to make yourself really approachable. The easier you are to talk to about these kinds of questions, the more likely it is your child will continue to talk to you about them. So try not to overreact to anything that happens, but to be a little bit more mellow about, I'm so glad we're talking about this. I didn't think about that. I don't know who that person is. Give me a minute to think it through. It's really fine to not have the answers. Our children are going to be teaching us about technology very soon. I mean, Erin's teenage daughter is already teaching her about technology, and she's teaching me too, because I get all my best information from Ashley. But besides that, this is not an area where we are going to be equal to our children in our understanding of how to navigate it. So you might as well start getting humble about it now and saying, tell me what it is that you came across and why it felt confusing, and let's figure it out together. Or what's happening that you don't like. Like Erin said, being the person that they can talk to doesn't mean you have to have all the answers and put new rules into place. It just means you have to partner with them, and you need to get smart about some of the things that you've never heard of before, which is the constant struggle in the tech area.
Constant. And I think here too is another example of modeling, right? So, modeling to your children, again, in an age appropriate way, but saying, I got this text from my friend and it seems like she's annoyed, but I don't know why she'd be annoyed. Just sort of like acknowledging that we too, as adults, experience confusion over what goes on online.
What's a great example of that is spam. I was explaining to my children, like, I get hundreds of emails every day where they use my name and they look like they know me and they just want me to buy something or donate to a campaign or do whatever, sign a petition, all the things, and trying to explain to them that, like, I don't know them, but here's how some of the ways they try to trick me into opening their email. They use my name and they make it sound like we are friends and the subject line. And, my kids were just totally fascinated by that as a concept, but that's a really easy segue into somebody online may not be the person you think they are, or they may want something from you that you don't realize that they want, right? And so I think you're right. In all those moments, we can model that this is something we have to learn and we have to deal with. It can help them to think like, oh, okay, that really is something that we're going to do. And the wonderful things too. You also model all of the wonderful things that you love about technology and the connection to others, like my endless, adoration of Zoom making these possible and virtual meetings possible and Cooper possible, right? There's a million wonderful things to celebrate. It's not all bad. You should and must use some sort of parental controls. If you have not done that already, there are so many different options in this space. We can't even tell you where to start, but you can definitely begin with the device you have and using just parental controls like a timer where apps no longer work, or permission to download something from the App Store. Really simple, basic Apple devices have that kind of stuff to start. And then it can get really complicated. And there are tons and tons and tons of articles you can read online about different ways to monitor it depending on what games or devices your children are using. But it's really an amazing feature that I think saves you a lot of the daily angst if you can just block. And it's not perfect and it doesn't replace a human, but it can get you there. It can help along the way. And finally, think about that responsibility in your home and in your community and building all of those other skills where you can say to your child, I'm not really worried about the other things you're doing online or that you're partaking in terms of screen time, because I'm seeing all this balance. I'm seeing that you're participating in all these other ways and really showing up in other ways. And when we think about our kids as a whole, we want it to be that balance. Yeah, you're spending a lot of time over here, but you're also doing all of these other things. And sometimes we're more intentional about telling them what not to do over here than trying to build up all of those other skills. So really thinking this summer, how can I help my child take on a challenge? How can I help them learn a new skill? How can I help them put themselves out there in a different way as a sort of buffer to all of the rest of the assault of screens and tech? So I think that's it. Oh, and we're back to modeling yourself. So if you did this whole talk while you were also on the phone and while you were listening, then you know what it is like to split your attention between multiple things and the impact that may have on your parenting. So I just want to say, I'm guilty of this all the time. I'm still answering an email. I'm sending a text. It might be about work. It might be about one of my friends. My kids ask me something and I am short with them. That fuse is I am distracted. I am not parenting in my best way. I'm not present in either category in my best way. When we model that kind of stuff to our kids, they learn about the pecking order in terms of our devices and our own behavior. If you are on the phone at dinner, you cannot have a rule that your kids can't be on the phone at dinner, right? We've kind of got to practice what we preach. We need to think about quality over quantity time. So when you can be together with your child and it's focused on quality, there don't need to be devices unless it's co-viewing, as Erin mentioned, which as your kids get older is one of the most phenomenal ways to have hard conversations, is to put on a movie that has some tricky content in there and be like, let's watch this together and talk about what we're seeing. It's one of my favorite ways to start those conversations. But dig into the idea of quality time, to thinking through the values in your family. Are those well represented? If you asked your child over age 5 or 6, really, like, what does this family stand for? What do we love in this family? What's important to us? Those are sort of your values. What does that look like? Do you need a mission statement? And all of these are things we do in Coop groups. So not to panic that you have to understand all of this today, but thinking about that. And finally, being able to tolerate your child's discomfort. Your kids will beg. They will beg endlessly. They will beg in more sophisticated ways as the years go on. Can you sit with, I know that you really want this and it's still not going to happen. And can you tolerate that pressure? Or are you likely to give in because you just want to see your kids happy when it might not be the right decision for them? So that's the sort of you role. I see we have a question already. I'm going to stop sharing so that we can read it at the same time. Sorry, yeah.
Oh yeah, no, go ahead.
Did you cover 3 and 5-year-olds in terms of the number of minutes per day on TV? So I think what we were saying, Suzanne, is like it's tough for the number of minutes as much as it's how do they respond to TV when it shuts off, and what is TV replacing that they're not doing? Are they still getting outside enough? Are they still sleeping well? Are they still, using language and having relationships and friendships and all of the rest? Or is the TV somehow interrupting that or taking away from that? And what time of day is the TV, and how does it fit with meals and bedtime and all the other things? So more that than just a number of minutes. Although I think 3 and 5-year-olds are on the less than an hour a day in the AAP general recommendations. Any other things, Erin? Are there things we forgot? Other questions? We have 5 minutes if anybody has any.
And also, like, we don't want it to make it sound like if your child already has a screen or a smartphone that they use, that's like a bad thing. And like Maria was saying, like, it's all within context. So also, if you have questions around, my child has a smartphone, I'm curious as to whether this, amount of time that they're spending on it is appropriate or not appropriate. We're open to all questions.
Open to all questions. Maybe everybody fell asleep. It's late at night. That's also okay.
It's poor air quality for a lot.
Oh, so true. Also, the fire sky. Well, then we will end it here. Thank you guys for being part of this. We're so excited that so many of you could join us, and we look forward to seeing you in Coop Group or at our next talk, and we will follow up with handouts, and the recording will be up on our assemblies page. So check it out anytime.
Thank you for joining.
Yay! Good night, Erin.
Good night.
Bye, everybody.